we arranged book tables, we arranged sort of chat rooms where sort of, smaller discussions could happen, and then a more sort of plenaire session where there would be every day 4 or 5 more formal kind of appointments and ping-pongs. And all of that was done with very few audience, sort of 30, 40 participants and maybe 20 testimonies, and sort of was then leading to a book. There was a special sort of homage to Francisco Varela, because we actually found out that all the participants in that event were related to the late Francisco Varela, and his sort of groundbreaking transdisciplinary research in neuroscience, and we somehow asked all the participants to make a tribute to Francisco, so that was bridge the gap. The next step was Laboratorium, where we actually tried to feed it back into this sort of idea of an exhibition. We tried out together with Barbara van der Linden in Antwerpen, and that again was an even bigger sort of event. So it's a bit like a seed, this sort of idea of art and brain grew, and from Bridge the Gap into Laboratorium became more into sort of more complex gatherings. With Laboratorium we wanted to find out what this notion of laboratory, which has been used so much in the 60s and 70s for cultural production, in theatre, in art, in museum, what that really means. So we gathered a think tank again, with all these projects, with Bruno Latour, a philosopher, historian of science, with Luc Steels again, who has Laboratory for Artificial Intelligence, with Carsten Höller, the artist, and we tried to develop all kinds of layers of laboratory notion. So the city as a laboratory, but also the laboratory as an invisible city, because you obviously have many, many laboratories in a city like Antwerp, like in every big city is full of laboratories. And what is really interesting is that nobody in Antwerp really knew that there are these more than 100 important laboratories. It was unknown. They said, you got the wrong city, we don't have any labs here. So with a group of students, we mapped all the laboratories in the city and tried to make this invisible city visible. We organized guided tours through the labs. At the same time, we invited 100 artists and architects to present their own laboratory in Antwerp to install. The question, can one move a laboratory? Can an architecture practice or a graphic designer or an artist move his studio or her studio for the time being of the exhibition? Obviously also the question of what does it mean, a studio or a laboratory in the late 20th, early 21st century, in terms of it being a sort of a networked reality. Is this idea of post-studio practice, it was defined in the 60s, still relevant? All of those were somehow questions. So within that there were like series cycles of lectures and conferences. So Bruno Latour curated a whole series of events which were called the tabletop experiments. So he invited scientists to redo a scientific experiment under all these sort of given premises and see if it would work or if it would fail. So there was a whole series of performative sort of tabletop experiments in the Scientific Institute in Antwerpen. At the same time, Carsten Höller installed the laboratory of doubt into Antwerpen. So this idea of a car which would drive around and spread doubt as a lab of doubt. And that went down to the catalogue, because obviously we also wanted the catalogue to be a kind of a laboratory condition. So we worked together with Bruce Mao and developed the catalogue, which was somehow actually, one could say, a permanent process. So the graphic designer Bruce Mao installed his office in Antwerpen during the exhibition, and every day new material was obviously added through the events, the lectures. They were immediately layouted and then installed as a one newspaper. So by the end of the show we had sort of 5,000 pages of catalogue which somehow filled the museum, which were then bound and given to the city of Antwerp as for their city archive, as a kind of a present, as a result also of this exhibition. And together with Dumont and Bruce Mao, we kind of published a best of, which then became a book. What obviously happened with all these exhibitions, is that it somehow also constitutes a community. The idea is also that a lot of practitioners who don't know each other start to spend time together, and so in this sense it somehow triggers things which can only be measured, so as to say, much later. So the results are not immediate. It's kind of very much about long distance running, and so obviously quite difficult to sort of implement it in the sort of political process. But luckily, I mean, in cities like Antwerp or Kita-Kyushu, there proved to be these sort of windows. It's also interesting that it's usually much more difficult to do that type of project in a city like London or Paris or New York. It's usually more periphery city who, for many reasons, this sort of kind of works. So that just as a sort of a premise. My doubt about the lecture or the conference or the symposium as a format, as Philip expressed it today, is sort of perfectly shared. But I was still thinking, what maybe tonight could be as a purpose, that I could somehow transfer, a few, particularly for those of you who haven't sort of participated in the seminar, some kind of information. And I was thinking that it could be maybe interesting to give you one very concrete example of an artistic project of the last few years, which I think is particularly relevant, and from there then take it and sort of make it a bit more extended. Because I think it's kind of interesting that we listen to a specific art project first. And the project I want to present to you is the project we've discussed Ville de Paris' participation extensively this morning to recreate Tiravanisha's The Land, but we haven't really presented the project in a more global sort of scale. And what I think is very interesting about The Land is that it's with Tiravanisha trying to sort of develop a notion of models of living. It's almost like a Weissenhof-Siedlung of the 21st century, but without being a kind of an utopia which would be imposed. It's much more a sort of a self-organized utopia, so as to say. So The Land is a project which Tiravanisha founded in the later part of the 90s near Chiang Mai in Thailand, and which actually started, or is very much part of an idea that more and more artists today refuse to display their kind of creativity exclusively within and upon the pristine walls of the gallery or museum space. We can observe that their curriculum vitae increasingly mention such diverse projects as fashion store, interiors, designs for restaurants, private residences, or public buildings, including city squares and underground metro stations. This inclination of art towards architecture and design emerges from the kind of revived interest of artists throughout the 90s to more actively question the role they play in society. And we can maybe say that in turning towards somehow kind of collaborative and transdisciplinary practices, artists have been defining new modes of bypassing formalist credos and interacting with the social reality of daily life. Rikki Tiravanisha has been a key figure, a key mover actually, of these evolutions and new forms of consciousness. When he revealed his ideas concerning The Land in the late 90s as a kind of a large collaborative and multidisciplinary research project taking place on a plot of land that Tiravanisha purchased in the village of San Patong near Chiang Mai, Thailand, he defined the land as a laboratory for self-sustainable development, but at the same time it's also a site, as I said initially, where new models for living kind of can be tested out. The sort of spark, or initial spark, was in 1998, and it was, as Tiravanisha told me in a recent interview, the idea of merging of ideas by different artists to cultivate a place of and as well for social engagement. It's been acquired in the name of artists who live in Chiang Mai, so it is a foundation which Tiravanisha did with very sort of strong local involvement. And as the artist explained to me, beginning of quote, we've been trying to find a way to turn it into a collective, to have the property owned by no one in particular, but that's one of the hardest things to do in Thailand. So actually it's only very recently that was solved and it could become a foundation. Tiravanisha underscored that one thing is certain, beginning of quote, the land is not a property, end of quote. To my question then, if the land is an art project, Tiravanisha replied, we don't want to have to deal with it as a presentation to the art structures, because I think it should be neutral, and it's also one of the reasons why it's not about property. End of quote. The land was thus started without the concept of ownership, and is cultivated using traditional Thai farming techniques. In the middle of the land are two working rice fields, monitored by a group of students from the University of Chiang Mai and the local village. The harvest is shared by all participants involved, and some local families suffering from the AIDS epidemic. So it's a very, very strong involvement of that communities from the very beginning. The land was not initiated by Tiravanisha uniquely as a space for structures to be designed, built and used by artists, even if many of the architectural projects today are being developed along those lines. A slew of prominent contemporary artists have designed or carried out projects for houses or self-sustaining sort of living device systems for the land.